President Biden sent CIA Director Bill Burns to meet with Putin. I traveled with him to Moscow, met with Putin, Patrushev at the Russian Security Council, and we delivered a message that Bill did. We see what you're planning to do. It is going to be a catastrophic mistake for Russia, for the world, and the response of the West is going to be nothing like you've seen before. Massive sanctions that will make the sanctions that were imposed in 2014-15 pale in comparison.
Right. All right, well, hello and welcome to tonight's Commonwealth Club World Affairs program from the front lines of Russia's war against the West. My name is Stephen Saum, and I'm Executive Director of Strategic Communications and Content at St. Mary's College of California, but maybe more relevant for tonight, someone whose life's been connected to Ukraine for the past 30 years or more. Before the US election last fall, President Donald Trump said he could end Russia's war in Ukraine on day one of his presidency. After more than 100 days, his administration appears to have made little progress. And the president recently threatened to walk away from negotiations if the two sides fail to move toward compromise. Ukraine and the US seem ready for a ceasefire. Russia is ready for a pause to celebrate Victory Day. Is there any hope of a peace deal or at least a meaningful ceasefire? Our guest this evening, John J. Sullivan, was U.S. ambassador to Russia at the time of the beginning of the full-scale invasion, and he joins us to help answer those questions and discuss the dramatic change in the U.S. relationship with both Russia and Ukraine. John J. Sullivan has served 5 presidents in prominent diplomatic and legal positions, including as U.S. ambassador to the Russian Federation under Presidents Joe Biden from January 2021 to October 22, and Donald Trump from December 2019 to January 2021. Before his post in Moscow, he served for almost 3 years as the U.S. Deputy Secretary of State. He's currently a distinguished fellow at Georgetown and Columbia Universities and a partner at Mayer Brown LLP. Ambassador Sullivan, welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Let me start off by asking a question very much of the moment. Right? As we sit here, it's past midnight in Moscow.
Yep.
It's already in the morning of May 8th. What does a Russian call for a ceasefire on Victory Day, for Victory Day celebrations mean?
What it means to me, it's a preposterous, cynical gesture by a leader of the Russian Federation, President Putin, who will never, emphasis on never, compromise his war aims in Ukraine, which he has said consistently, he and his foreign minister and everyone who works for him. They will denazify, their term, and demilitarize Ukraine. And that's when they talk today about addressing the underlying causes of the war. They don't want a 30-day ceasefire, which the Ukrainians have already agreed to. Zelensky's already agreed to that long ago. The Russians won't. And Putin says, well, wait a minute, we're not going to agree to a ceasefire unless we can address the underlying problems that caused this situation. And the underlying problem is that Ukraine has the temerity to try to exercise sovereignty over its territory and its people, and that's something that Putin cannot abide. So he's using, the White House has rejected this idea that it's a significant gesture, a 3-day ceasefire to correspond to his ahistorical celebration of the Soviet victory, not the Russian victory, the Soviet victory in what they call the Great Patriotic War. And for those of you, I don't suppose there are any World War II veterans here with us, for those of you who have relatives, parents, grandparents, who fought in the Second World War in the Pacific Theater, as my father did and as his brother did in the U.S. Navy, it was a surprise to me how much the Russians discount the war in the Pacific. Russia was at war in the Pacific for a matter of days at the end of the war in August 1945 to seize territory from Japan. Other than that, the wars in Europe, the Red Army won the war, Russia won the war, and that's the historical cudgel that Putin uses to justify his nationalism and his imperial ambitions with respect to Ukraine. And I'll conclude with one fact when I say it was the Soviet victory. Per capita, and this is what infuriates Ukrainians, per capita, there were more casualties among Belarusians and Ukrainians during the war, the Great Patriotic War, the Second World War, than Russians. And it makes sense. It's where the battles were fought. There were more heroes of the Soviet Union for heroism in the Second World War per capita in Ukraine than in Russia. The notion that Russia can claim for itself, as it has, with, in some cases, the acquiescence of the United States, for example, to the Soviet Union's seat on the UN Security Council, which was given to it. Russia is not the Soviet Union, but Putin equates it. And for many Russian nationalists, they equate Soviet Union and Russia, Russia and the Soviet Union. Some distinguished American diplomats have done the same thing in the past. If you read Kennan's writings, right, his famous long telegram and his X article on the sources of Soviet conduct, he refers interchangeably to Soviets and Russians, Russia and the Soviet Union. But the Soviet Union was 15 republics, 350 million people. As big as Russia is today, it's less than 150 million people. It's a shadow of the Soviet Union. But all that historical memory, Putin is arrogating it to Russia and to himself, is embodying that heroism that defeated the Nazi juggernaut, that defeated the Germans who launched Operation Barbarossa against the Soviet Union in June of '41. And it's a historical weapon because it is an ahistorical narrative.
Well, and while you were ambassador to Russia, right, Putin released a couple of historical revisions, one specifically on World War II, and then the grand one on
Ukraine. Yeah, it was interesting because if you look at the chronology, and I've now had the opportunity, hindsight is always much clearer, of course, looking back, particularly on 2021, and where that he wrote this magazine article, lengthy article, that basically to try to make the point that Ukraine is not really a country separate from Russia. Russians and Ukrainians, Slavic sisters and brothers, all descended from, the great Kievan Rus from over 1,000 years ago. But as I look back now on that calendar year, 2021, and the lead up to the war, Putin meets with Biden in June of 2021, a presidential summit in Geneva. I was with President Biden when he met with Putin. I think it was June 16th. What did the two presidents not talk about all day? Oh, it came up in passing. But I'll tell you, as a matter of fact, they spent more time talking about Afghanistan and what was then the ongoing U.S. withdrawal and the U.S. desire for a new base in Central Asia for a counterterrorism mission to compensate for facilities we were losing in Afghanistan. They spent more time talking about the Arctic, about Afghanistan, about cyber issues. And it wasn't an affirmative point for Biden to make a big deal out of, because in my experience, from the start of the first Trump administration through the Biden administration, Ukraine just wasn't a top priority for the United States, even with Russia. We were deferring to the French and the Germans, who had gotten together with the Russians and the Ukrainians to draft the so-called Minsk agreements that you've probably heard about and many remember in 2014 and 15. But we were content up to and including October of 2021, when I was sent in to meet with, in the Office of Presidential Administration, not with Putin himself, but his principal deputy, his deputy chief of staff responsible for Ukraine negotiations. And the message I conveyed was, we, the United States, want to be helpful in trying to reduce the ongoing, still low level, but ongoing violence in the Donbass and achieve a more durable solution, but we did not want to substitute ourselves for the French and the Germans. Ukraine wasn't a priority for the United States. It was an overwhelming priority for Putin. So what does he do in June? He doesn't raise it. And this is the way Putin operates, the way a good, as he calls himself, he's a KGB man, and he follows that up by saying there's no such thing as a former KGB man. As a good Chekist, an inheritor of that Chekist ethos, the Cheka was formed in December 1917 by Lenin during the revolution, and its leader was, ironically enough, a Pole descended from Polish Catholic nobility, Felix Dzerzhinsky, by then a dedicated Bolshevik, in the original secret police at the start of the revolution, but built on a heritage going back over centuries to the Oprichniki, the Tsar's secret police under Ivan the Terrible, or the Okhrana under Nicholas II and some of his immediate predecessors. This idea of this secret police that weren't bound by law or morals. They would do anything that was necessary either to protect the Tsar or to protect the revolution and Lenin. And now the FSB today, the Russian Federal Security Service, is the principal inheritor of the KGB. And they have inherited the mantle from the Cheka. And so Putin has got, his idea, and we can get into this, about his worldview and what his ambitions are with respect to Ukraine. But just as a matter of personal style and negotiating and the way he comports himself, the more he wants something, this is completely unlike most Americans. The more he wants something, the less he will let you know that he does or that it matters to him. Me, I don't, so I'll give you one example. He wanted Trump to come to the Victory Day parade. It was postponed from May 9th, 2000 because of the pandemic to June 2020, June 24th. He really if he got the American president to come to that, it would be a big deal for him. And I knew he really, really wanted it. So how did he raise the issue with me as ambassador? It was, I've invited Trump. I hope he comes, but if he doesn't, it's complete. What he's really thinking, I hope he comes. If you're really well trained in the KGB, that's the last thing that you will signal to the world, something you really want. What did he really want in June of 2021? Ukraine. What's the last thing he would give the impression to Biden that he was obsessing about? Ukraine. So then we start to as the events go forward, in July, he writes this article, so the historical basis for why Ukrainians and Russians are one people, Slavic sisters and brothers, and related to that is his warped historical analysis of the Second World War. And then he and his surrogates turn to, in August, Afghanistan, and the debacle that was the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. I'm often asked, was that a reason that Putin decided to invade Ukraine? Absolutely not. It was in fact something that he weaponized to use against Ukraine in the following sense. The secretary of the Russian Security Council at the time, a fellow named Nikolai Patrushev, Leningrader, roughly the same age as Putin. They joined the KGB at the same time in Leningrad, very close to the Russian president. He succeeded Putin as head of the FSB, and then he became secretary of the Security Council, roughly the equivalent of the National Security Advisor at the White House. Not quite the same, but close. And Patrushev gives an interview to Russian state media. So that means, when Putin gives an interview to Russian state media, it's Putin asking himself questions, right? So this is, Patrushev is giving an interview, and the thrust of the interview was August 19th. I remember it, August 19th. It was a week. The withdrawal in Afghanistan is going very badly for us, but it was before the terrorist attack at the Kabul airport on August 26th. It was a week before. And this is the thrust of his interview in Russian. It wasn't directed to the United States or even to the Russian people. It was to the Ukrainian people. And this was his message to them. It is beyond my comprehension why you want to align yourself with the West and the United States. Why would you ever want to join NATO? You can't trust NATO. You can't trust the United States. Look what they're doing to their major non-NATO ally in Afghanistan today. And this is a country, this is Patrushev speaking, this is a country where the United States over 20 years has invested a huge amount of resources to defeat the Taliban, et cetera, to address security challenges that were posed to the United States in what we call then the global war on terror 20 years ago. They had invested so much, and they're walking away from them, just as they did in Vietnam. Why would you trust them? We're your Slavic sisters and brothers. We're one, we're one great civilization, a Ruski Mir, the Russian world. What you want to do with these people? They're just going to leave you, this was his as translated expression, they're going to leave you twisting in the wind. Look what they're doing in Kabul today. It was a weapon. It wasn't a reason for Putin to win. He'd already decided what he was going to do. So then we fast forward, that's August, into October, and at that point, the buildup of the Russian military in southwestern Russia, out of Rostov and in Crimea, was beyond what they had done in the spring of 2020.
Like 60,000 troops in the spring, right?
It's now 180,000. But it wasn't just the numbers. It was, and it's amazing what the U.S. intelligence community can, much of it is technical means, satellites, and can have they had a high degree of confidence that given the number of troops and the logistical prepper, they were doing things logistically that no country would do unless they were actually going to go to war. It wasn't just that they were setting up field hospitals. They were stocking plasma. They were doing things that they would only do if they really were going to launch a war. And the United States government was convinced of that by the end of October. I happened to be home on leave from Moscow, and I got called into a meeting with the secretary, and we went and got briefed by the IC, in a meeting organized by the NSC, by the White House, and it was a pretty stark presentation about, he's going to do it now. We didn't, and we were right. We didn't think he was going to do it in the spring, but now we were. President Biden sent CIA Director Bill Burns to meet with Putin. I traveled with him to Moscow, met with Putin, Patrushev at the Russian Security Council, and we delivered a message that Bill did. We see what you're planning to do. It is going to be a catastrophic mistake for Russia, for the world, and the response of the West is going to be nothing like you've seen before. Massive sanctions that will make the sanctions that were imposed in 2014-15 pale in comparison. And what did Patrushev and Putin do? As Chekists, well trained by the KGB, That was their response. You know, Patrushev said to Bill literally, yeah, sanctions hurt. We're not the economic colossus that the Soviet Union was. Sanctions hurt us. We can't compete economically with the United States or the West. And the sanctions you've already imposed would hurt. If you put more on us, that would hurt. But our military, by the way, Ambassador Burns, our military, we've invested a lot in, and we have a lot of confidence in. And if there's a problem, I'm not saying we're going to invade Ukraine. In fact, we're not going to invade Ukraine. But if there's a problem in our neighborhood, we have the wherewithal to take care of it. So thank you for your concern, but have a nice day. That was basically what Patrushev and Putin said to Burns. And Burns wrote a memo to the president laying that out. And the conclusion, and they asked for my view, I shared it, was that Putin was going to do it. He may not have made the final decision to launch, the missiles and the aircraft and the tanks across the border, but he had done everything to prepare to do that. And that built over the next, Bill was in Moscow on November 2nd, over the next 3.5 months, it was just everything the Russians were doing logistically said, it's going to be an invasion. It's going to be a large invasion. It's not going to be what President Biden speculated about in late January of 2022, a minor incursion, I think was the expression that the president used. No, this was going to be a major invasion. And among the reasons why we thought it was so was that the Russians were sending troops into Belarus at levels we really hadn't seen before. There had been joint military exercises between Belarus and Russia, but not with this number of troops. And they were all stationed on the southern border of Belarus, on the border with Ukraine. If you look at a map, it's not far from Kyiv. And the logistical preparations they were making there said, these troops, they're crossing the border en masse, south from Belarus. It's going to be a strike on Kyiv. This is going to be a massive invasion. And we warned about it for 3 months. We engaged in diplomacy, tried to, with the Russians. And it was the Russians engaged in what I call, in my book, sham diplomacy. So I was there. I wrote my book because I was a witness. I saw it. I saw what happened. I saw what the justifications that they used, how they engaged in sham diplomacy. I would sit across the table from senior Russian diplomats or Kremlin officials, and they would just read talking points. And I would talk, I'd be well briefed, but I would talk as I'm talking to you tonight. And I'd ask a question. I'd say, well, you just said X, and what about Y? And the person, my interlocutor, would go back through his notes, what had been cleared by everyone, and he would read the most relevant point that he could find that was related to Y. And it may not be related that much at all, but he was not, and they were all men, they were not authorized to vary from those talking points. There was no give and take. It was a crisis atmosphere created by the Russians. There was no answer to my question. If this is such an existential matter now for the Russian Federation in November of December of 2021, why didn't your president raise it with President Biden a few months ago in Geneva? Go back to their talking points and read, have a nice day, Mr. Ambassador. So, I'm sorry. I am of Irish ancestry. My grandparents were born in Ireland. I've kissed the Blarney Stone twice. I tend to talk. I am sorry. I will shut up.
Well, I think this is an audience that's here to hear you talk, and we have lots of questions, and we're getting some from them as well. But
Great.
I think kind of building off of what you've talked about and how you've written about how Putin is the preeminent Chekist of his generation.
Yeah.
What do you make of, for example, the meetings that Steve Witkoff has had?
Yeah. So, I mean, when I wrote a whole chapter about, when I wrote my chapter that focuses principally on Putin and his background, I titled it The Chekist. And this is a thing, as the kids today say. It's a thing. I'm not making this up. There is Cheka Day. I'm going to forget the precise date. It's in early December, and it commemorates December 1917, when Lenin and Dzerzhinsky founded the Cheka. Putin celebrates Cheka Day. He has a statue of Dzerzhinsky in virtually every office he has. He self-identifies as a Chekist. And remember, the Cheka was the prime author of the Red Terror. The victims of the Red Terror during the Revolution and the Civil War and continuing into the Stalin era is unknown. How many tens of thousands of people were executed extrajudicially because they were deemed enemies of the revolution. This is the Cheka, and this is what Putin identifies with. Footnote, talking about the Cheka and Stalin and the purges, Putin is engaging in a slow burn rehabilitation of Stalin. A week ago, he's in Volgograd with Lukashenko, the president of Belarus. What did he do? He didn't rename Volgograd Stalingrad, although they're commemorating the great victory over Germany 80 years ago. But he renamed the Volgograd International Airport Stalingrad International Airport. He's crushed organizations, Memorial, that were organized and dedicated to exposing the abuses, particularly in the Soviet era under Stalin, and all of the people who lost their lives or were imprisoned in the Gulag system. Memorial has been disbanded. It's been sanctioned. Most of the founders or those people associated with have either been arrested and are now in labor camps themselves or have had to flee Russia. So this Chekist has got this imperial quest, and Ukraine is at the heart of it. So to get to your question, that's my long wind-up. Again, I kissed the Blarney Stone twice, okay? When the United States goes in to negotiate with someone with that background, there is no negotiation. I write about this in my book. I came to the conclusion early on that it's not possible, as we use the term negotiate, it's not possible to negotiate with the Russian Federation. Now, don't misunderstand me. Some people think when I say that, well, what do you mean? We got to talk. Yes, I am in complete agreement that we need to talk to the Russians. We need to tell them things, and even more importantly, we need to listen, which Americans in particular aren't good at. So, yes, we should be telling the Russians things, but to accept some of the things and statements that the Russians have done over the last few months at face value, or even not at face value, just contrary to fact. So I'll give you one example. So the Russians Putin released as a good faith gesture by the Russian government. They released a teacher, a guy named Mark Fogel, who had taught at the Anglo-American school in Moscow, which had been founded decades ago by the US, UK, and Canadian embassies. But it's a great school. Putin sent one of his daughters there. The school has now been closed by the Russian government since the war started, but Putin sent one of his daughters there. There were more Russian students than any other nationality at the Anglo-American school. Second largest group of students at the Anglo-American school, South Koreans. Mostly South Koreans whose parents worked for Samsung. Great school. Mark Fogel was a beloved teacher at the Anglo-American school. He was arrested in August of 2021 roughly 6 months before Brittany Griner was arrested in February of 22. Brittany was arrested a week before the war started, and they were charged with a crime for exactly the same conduct. They each had trace amounts of medicinal marijuana in their luggage when they arrived in Moscow. And unlike in the United States, where marijuana laws have been relaxed, it is a crime to possess marijuana in the Russian Federation, and they had trace amounts. Mark was arrested in August of 21, Brittany Griner in February, I think it was February 17th of 22. Fogel was, and this is how the Russians manipulate their criminal justice system. There is an answer to your question, bear with me. This is how the Russians manipulate their criminal justice system. I use as a hypothetical, if you were in Moscow and you cross one of the major thoroughfares, the Ring Road, and you jaywalk, and you get stopped by a local police officer, an Interior Ministry officer, and you think, oh, what's the worst that can happen to me? Yeah, I probably shouldn't have been trying to run across 8 lanes of traffic.
What's the fine for doing that?
What's the fine for jaywalking? What you didn't realize was that you were intentionally trying to disrupt traffic as a protest against the special military operation and Putin, and you wound up being charged with something like treason. And you get a sentence of 15 years in a labor camp. Mark Fogel had trace amounts of medicinal marijuana. Should he have had it in his luggage? No. What did he get? Well, first, the Russians, he's arrested. We get notice of it because he's a US citizen. And the police show up at the Anglo-American school. His wife also taught at the school. And they claimed that that couple was dealing drugs to students at the school. He had trace amounts of medicinal marijuana. There was no evidence of what, and this was in the press, that the Russian police were investigating narcotics trafficking by these teachers at the Anglo-American school. By the way, again, Putin sent his daughter there. This is not a shabby institution. This was a fine school from K through high school, big school. And the proof at trial was just what I described, trace amounts of medicinal marijuana. He was convicted of narcotics trafficking and sentenced to 14 years in a labor camp. Brittany Griner, same charge, a tiny bit more marijuana in a cartridge, and she got 9 years. And this was a popular athlete in Yekaterinburg. It was a revelation to me that there were American athletes like Brittany who earned $1 million a year to play basketball in Yekaterinburg for a Russian oligarch who owned a women's basketball team in Yekaterinburg. She made $1 million a year. Hello, of course she's going to be, she makes a fraction of that playing in the WNBA. That's why she's coming to Russia. Why? The Russians aren't big supporters of most women. Some women's sports they support, gymnastics. One of Putin's wives is a rhythmic gymnast, was on the Russian Olympic team. Gymnastics, that's okay, but other women's sports not really supported by the Russian Federation. But women's basketball was popular in Yekaterinburg, and Brittany gets 9 years in a labor camp. But because she's a former Olympic gold medalist, I think more than one gold medal, WNBA star, huge publicity, the United States traded for her by the end of 2022, December, as I recall, first week of December of 2022. Fogel, he's a history teacher. He's languishing in a labor camp. And I give you all this background because this is how our administration described it. Witkoff goes to Moscow, meets with Putin, and there have been some discussions about Fogel. I had been a big proponent of having him declared wrongfully detained by the US government. It took longer for him because he wasn't a reporter for the Wall Street Journal or a gold medal winning Olympic basketball player. He was just a history teacher. But finally we got him declared wrongfully detained. So it was known to the US government that he was framed and given a 14-year sentence in a labor camp, a 65-year-old man. So Putin releases Fogel, and it's reported it's a goodwill gesture. No recognition of the fact that he was wrongfully detained to begin with, had by that point spent 3 years of a labor camp for a so-called crime that he wouldn't have spent 3 hours behind bars for in the United States.
Those are dog years you're spending in a labor camp.
I've been to a number of Russian labor camps. And these, Paul Whelan, if you've heard the name, Paul was detained for, almost 6 years. And he was at a labor camp, he was at IK-17, which is in Mordovia, about an 8-hour drive south of Moscow. Built in the mid-20s, part of the Gulag system by Stalin, housed Nazi POWs from, among other places, Stalingrad during the Second World War. And it hadn't been renovated since then. And, unpaved roads, goats and chickens walking around outside the barbed wire of the camp. It's a brutal existence. But the American public was told this was a good faith gesture by Putin. And it gets worse, because we were told initially there hadn't been a trade. All of the other Americans have been released. We, the United States, release dangerous criminals. Victor Bout, notorious arms trafficker, his pilot, Konstantin Yaroshenko, nominally an Aeroflot pilot, in fact, convicted of a real narcotics trafficking conspiracy, was arrested in Liberia and extradited to the United States. We release serious Russian criminals to get wrongfully detained Americans like Evan Gershkovich, Brittany Griner, et cetera, released. We were initially told this was just a good faith gesture by Putin, releasing Mark Fogel. I objected to that, given the background of the case, but we later find out that we had extradited a Russian cyber criminal who had inflicted enormous financial damage on Americans through cyber crimes. He was arrested in Cyprus and extradited to the United States. We released him in a trade. And this is a good faith gesture. This is a small thing. It has emotional significance to me because I know Mark Fogel, and I know what the Russians did to him. And it's presented by our government as if, he was on a holiday and he broke his leg in a skiing accident, and out of the goodness of their hearts, the Russians took him and they've given us to him. They put him in a labor camp, and he was going to stay there planted for 14 years unless we released a pretty significant Russian cyber criminal. That's not a good faith gesture. That's evidence of our dealing with a Chekist, a KGB man, the Chekist of all Chekists, who is president of the Russian Federation. My concern is we are sending people to negotiate with Putin who don't understand him. And how do I have the nerve to say that? How do I understand Putin? I've met with him, but it's more than that, and it's just a function, if I'm honest, it's a function of the pandemic. And what do I mean by that? There was a significant lockdown not long, just a few months after I'd arrived as ambassador, and every meeting I had with a Russian government official was canceled. We would engage by phone. If they were angry with us or annoyed with us, they'd sometimes make us communicate by fax. We had some old agreements with them, entered into the late 80s or the early 90s, where the official means of transmission was facsimile. And if they really wanted to get under my skin, they'd say, you can't send it to us electronically. You have to send it by fax. So we have to dust off the fax machine and send them a fax. But my schedule got cleared. For 13 months, I was isolated in Moscow. And what did I do? I virtually lived I didn't have my family with me. I virtually lived in the CIA station. It is publicly disclosed. I'm not disclosing something that is not public. The CIA has an office at the U.S. Embassy, as it does at virtually every other U.S. embassy. It's called the station. The head of most senior CIA person there is known as the station chief, and he is publicly identified to the Russians as our CIA representative. He also, we would refer to each other as, we were geographic bachelors, because his family was in the United States, mine was, and I lived in the station. I just got an education, a graduate degree in Putin and Russia over 13 months because I was so interested in, amazed and appalled by what I was learning about Putin and his government. But my point of saying all that is, I have a fair amount of confidence in what I say about Putin as a result. My understanding is, and I hope I'm wrong, is that the people who are, and this isn't Marco Rubio, but I believe it's Mr. Witkoff, aren't getting nearly the briefings, and not just because they don't have 13 months of time to devote to it. As I understand it, he's just going in cold. And going in cold to talk to somebody like Vladimir Putin, if you send somebody in cold like that, they come out saying things like, what a good faith gesture. He's given me Mark Fogel. Or it was so touching to hear that when President Putin said, with a tear in his eye, that he said a prayer when President Trump was shot in Pennsylvania. My reaction was, yeah, he was laughing so hard. He was, because it's a symbol. It's not because, Putin isn't a fan of Trump in the sense of he personally agrees with the president's program. He wants chaos in the United States. He wants us divided and weakened. So the more that grotesque things like that happen, the better it is. But the notion that an American diplomat would attribute good faith motives to releasing a wrongfully detained American that we had to trade a serious Russian criminal for, or that Putin said a prayer for Trump because he'd been shot, I don't know what to make of that, other than I guess the most benign explanation is he doesn't know what he's talking about. Well, I have no idea whether I answered your question. I apologize. I just get on a roll and I just start talking.
Yeah, well, it was about Witkoff, and we have quite.
I guess I did. My apologies, Mr. Witkoff,
from the audience.
Yeah,
and connected to that though is, of course, in the disastrous meeting that Zelensky had in the White House, Zelensky was trying to say, but he keeps breaking these agreements.
Yeah,
you can't trust him. Today we heard J.D. Vance say Putin may be asking for too much.
Yep.
So what do you make of that?
I told you so. How can you not say, if anybody who has studied Putin, his government, the history of Russia and Ukraine for the last, 20 plus years, that's no surprise. Look, I don't want to be mistaken. If our president could end this war, and who wants to see innocent Ukrainians, young, old, children, elderly, anyone, killed by missile strikes, drone strikes, etc., no one wants to see that. So and Ukrainians most of all, they want peace, but not at any cost. And that's when I saw that meeting of Zelensky in the Oval Office with President Trump and with the vice president, we can critique, and it is subject to legitimate, rational critique, how Zelensky comported himself, and it was a wise thing to do, and I don't think it was. But on the other hand, I'm willing to spot him a little bit of patience, given what that man has been through. If you think about it, this is a person who, on February 24th, 2022, everyone in the US government, from the president on down, including the president's ambassador in Moscow, thought that he didn't have a prayer of surviving this if he didn't get out of Kyiv, out of Ukraine immediately. And there were organized squads, some of them were from Chechnya, some of them were with the FSB. The Russians, Putin wanted him. It's almost, it was, if you think of, it's the type of vendetta. It's almost biblical. It's like King Herod wanting John the Baptist's head on a platter. He wants Zelensky's head on a platter. And that guy had the nerve to stay there. I don't know how many of us would. He's a pretty brave guy. And the stress that he's been through over the last 3+ years of leading his country during that war, it goes beyond Churchill during the Second World War, during the Blitz. What the Russians have done to Ukraine with troops on the ground that weren't troops on the ground in the United Kingdom, don't get me wrong, the Blitz was horrible, and credit to the United Kingdom and their government and their people for resisting the Nazis. But look at what Zelensky, his government, his hometown gets hit all the time with these really powerful Russian missiles. There was just an attack, last week, killed a bunch of kids at a playground, and that town is targeted because that's Zelensky's hometown. So if he's sitting in the Oval Office and he gets animated and starts to contradict the president or the vice president about how Putin can't be trusted, I'd give him a little bit of, I'd cut him a little slack. Now, he's gone back and, tried to, repair relations with the United States, and apparently he had a brief but positive meeting with the president at the Vatican following the funeral for Pope Francis. We've signed, the United States and Ukraine, this so-called minerals agreement. And we can get into this. I'm sure there'll be questions about what the future holds. What I think is we're already seeing signs of this is what we've endured for, and the Ukrainians have endured for the last 3+ years. It's going to continue. Why? What are the two things I've noticed recently? Putin, yet again, as he does every so often, rattled his nuclear saber, and he doesn't just go on TV or give an interview or say, "I've got nuclear weapons, I could use them." What does he say? All he has to do is mention it, and he mentions it in a very Chekist way. Thank God we didn't have to use nuclear weapons so far in the special military operation. Thank God for that. He's asked a question. I said this once to the Deputy Foreign Minister, Sergei Ryabkov, whom I considered a friend, and he once raised the specter of nuclear war. We're talking about the Minsk agreements and the situation in Ukraine, and all of a sudden he shifted from talking about that to, he said, John, if we don't solve this, the next thing, we'll be in the midst of the Caribbean crisis. And I had learned by then that that's what the Russians call the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's the Caribbean crisis. And I said, Sergei, this conversation went, I used an old, auto television ad. I'm not sure if he understood. I said, Sergei, this conversation went from 0 to 60 in no time flat. We're talking about a federated system for governing Ukraine, and you now shift to strategic nuclear war between the United States and Russia? It's one of their talking points. It's the one, among the strengths they have, undisputable, the largest stockpile of nuclear weapons in the world. And if you're a Chekist like Putin, there's nothing you won't say or do to protect the state, and the state you view as Putin is Russia, Russia is Putin. If the good Lord has given you oil and gas and nuclear weapons, you use energy as a weapon and you threaten the use of your nuclear weapons. And all you have to do if you're the Russian president is mention them. Mention them by saying, thank God we didn't have to use them so far. His phrase was, we'll bring the special military operation to its logical conclusion. If I'm in the White House and Putin is talking about nuclear weapons, it's back to the future. It's the same thing he's been doing since the start of the war with Biden. Second piece of evidence. We are arranging, the United States, along with some allies, to provide a new Patriot missile battery to Ukraine. The State Department has also notified a new $50 million, it's not big, not a big dollar amount, but $50 million weapons purchase by Ukraine. Signals that the United States is going to, I hope, continue to support militarily and with intelligence Ukraine. That's where this is headed. My prediction is, as they say in government, in writing a memo, bluff, bottom line up front, this violence isn't going to stop. Even if there's a ceasefire, and there won't be, but even if there were, Ukrainians are going to be killing Russians, Russians are going to be killing Ukrainians, because the brutality of this war, it's something Americans it's hard to wrap your mind around. But think about this. 15 million Ukrainians since the start of the war, killed, wounded, internally displaced, or international refugees. This war may have started with a large population, a large segment of the Ukrainian population favorably disposed toward Russia generally, Russian speakers, ethnic Russians, considering themselves ethnic Russians. The brutality, emptying Russian prisons to give Prigozhin and Wagner, what we call Wagner, his military contractor, a rogue army to fight in Ukraine and to commit brutal war crimes, and then the prisoner volunteers themselves are abused by Wagner. I mean, they're just sent to be slaughtered in human wave attacks on entrenched Ukrainian positions. And then when they exercise some rational thought and say, geez, I'm not going over the top, they're subject to military discipline in the Wagner outfit. And the Uniform Code of Military Justice Wagner style is, you don't follow an order to attack, we put your head on a stone and we split it open with a sledgehammer. The sledgehammer became the symbol of the Wagner units in Ukraine. The brutality of this war and what it's done to more than a third of the Ukrainian population, they're not going to forgive and forget. If Zelensky, and he doesn't, but if he did, want to compromise and trade territory in the Donbass, Crimea, etc., for some notional peace with the Russians, he wouldn't remain as president, because the Ukrainians don't trust Putin or his government, and there's just too much that's happened, too much brutality, too many people killed. They are not going to quit. And I analogize it to, I keep bringing up my Irish heritage, I analogize it to Ulster. I mean, there's still violence between Protestants and Catholics in Ulster, in Belfast. It's not the same type of, large-scale IRA terrorist attack, but there's still walls with barbed wire up in Belfast. And this is going to be an Ulster on a much bigger scale. And Protestants killing Catholics or Catholics killing Protestants, Ukrainians and Russians, this isn't just going to go away with some peace that's forced on Ukraine by the United States negotiating with Russia and try to cut Ukraine out. One other fact that's also important to note is that the United States, Secretary Rubio, I think Vance himself have said, and may have said it at the Munich conference, in Munich Security Conference in Washington recently, is that this isn't going to be solved until the Ukrainians are at the table negotiating with the Russians. It's not going to be negotiated by the United States with Russia.
It'll actually take them talking to one another, which, what comes to mind is, of course, back when Russia had just carved off the Luhansk People's Republic and Donetsk People's Republic, Putin said, "Oh, you got to talk to them, right? Don't talk to us. You need to talk to those guys. That's the problem." Yeah,
and so that's a great example of how that was the Russian strategy. This is before the fall of or even into the fall of 2021. Those few occasions when I was tasked to engage with them on Ukraine, the Russian response was always, "You're talking to the wrong party. We're not a party to the conflict in Russia. You need to get the people's representatives in Donetsk and Luhansk to talk to your vassals," their word, the Russians' word, not mine, "your vassals in Kyiv, and get them to solve the problem. This is a Ukraine problem. This isn't a Russia problem. Why are you bringing this up with us?" And of course, that's there are so many problems with that statement. I mean, this is a problem created by Russia, by Putin. So of course they and by the way, Russia was a signatory to both of the Minsk agreements. So it's just it's contrary to fact. It's like saying the sun rises in the west and sets in the east. But what you eventually learn if you spend enough time in Russia, and if you follow the Chekist line, if that's the truth that the state needs, then the sun rises in the west and sets in the east. And if you disagree, enjoy your time in IK-12 or IK-17. So, but the problem, and I said this earlier, was when the United States was talking to Russia, the Russians were saying, "Don't talk to us. Get the Ukrainians, get Kyiv to talk to the separatists." What I was told to say was, we, the United States, want to talk to you about solving this problem, but we don't want to step in to the role that's being played by Germany, the German government and the French government, who have the lead, who have had the lead for years, and were the original signatories to and negotiated the Minsk agreements. This was not a priority for the United States.
So there are a number of questions here, of course, that ask kind of variations on, assuming that aid from the United States continues in some form, is this a war that the Ukraine can win? And let me also kind of complement that with something that you do say in your book. There's no conceivable outcome in which the withdrawal of support for the defense of Ukraine materially reduces the defense budget of the United States.
Right. Well, that's true. I mean, that's been a talking point for me, and I am often asked to speak as a fellow Republican to Republican members of Congress who were concerned about, how much money we're dedicating to defending Ukraine. Why are we spending $61 billion? I'm more concerned about the southwestern border of the United States than I am with the border of Ukraine. And my strategy in dealing with those arguments was to accept, in some sense, the premise, okay, you don't care about Ukraine, but you got to care about Russia. If you don't care about Russia, then why do we have $1 billion defense budget? It's not all about the People's Republic of China. What are we spending $1 billion to defend ourselves from and our allies from if it's not, maybe not in some people's view, 50-50 China and Russia, but Russia is a strategic threat to the United States, if only by virtue of its enormous nuclear arsenal. You've got to have a Russia policy, a security policy that addresses Russia. And no one would disagree with that. No member of Congress would disagree with that. And if your policy doesn't include addressing what Russia is doing in Ukraine, then you don't have a coherent Russia policy. Because this is the most important thing to Putin, his war in Ukraine. And every dollar we spend to help the Ukrainians defend themselves is helping to defend the United States against our mutual enemy, Putin's word, not mine. He says the United States is the enemy of the Russian Federation. So I take him at his word. I do listen to what Putin says. Every dollar we spend to help Ukraine against our mutual enemy supports the national security of the United States and our allies, and that's important. So it's my frustration is that I see where this is going, and if you had told me, I was asked in the fall before the election, so is Trump going to be able to solve the Ukraine war in 24 hours once he becomes of course not. Would Putin have invaded Ukraine if Trump had been reelected and served a second term? And the answer to that is it's a little more complicated. I don't know that, the honest answer to that question is, I don't know about the invasion. What I do know is Putin was going to accomplish his war aims, denazify and demilitarize Ukraine, in one of two ways. What the Russians call military technical means, the special military operation, a massive invasion, or Ukraine was going to capitulate. And Putin was either going to manipulate a second Trump term to undermine Ukraine, not support Ukraine when under threat of invasion by Russia, so that Ukraine has to capitulate, or he was going to invade. So, yeah, I'm not saying he would have invaded, but it's not a good answer to say he wouldn't have invaded because he would have undermined U.S. support for Zelensky and caused Ukraine, in some sense, to have to capitulate. I'm not saying that's likely, but what's happening now is, of course, you asked me about the vice president's remarks today, or I guess it was today. I mean, that's, I don't, what I can't understand sometimes is I see people who I know better. And it's almost Russian-like, Chekist-like, in saying the sun rises in the west and sets in the east, that the war in Ukraine was really started by the United States against Russia. It wasn't when the tanks and airplanes and missiles crossed the border before dawn on February 24th. It was the United States that started this war. That Putin wasn't the aggressor. And these are people I know should know better. And part of their rationale is, I'm sure, and if asked, they would say, we're trying to get to an agreement with the Russians. We can't just continue, the policy, the Biden administration policies and statements about Russia. We're trying to get Putin to make concessions. So we don't want to keep saying Putin's a war criminal. Although what I'd like to remind people is on that particular issue, and I lived through this in early 2017, when President Trump's first Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, the former chairman and CEO of ExxonMobil, was at his confirmation hearing before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And it's minor historical fact. His hearing was extended to 10 hours because there was one particular senator who was really upset with the secretary designate and delayed his confirmation by 10 days because Secretary Tillerson, or the secretary designate, wouldn't answer the following question: is Vladimir Putin a war criminal? And this particular senator kept asking it, and Tillerson was trying to avoid answering because he'd say, I'm going to be Secretary of State. I need to deal with the Russians, including the president of the Russian Federation. It doesn't help me in that endeavor if I start off my tenure by calling him a war criminal. And this senator would say, you can't be the chief U.S. diplomat if you don't understand who our, and I think he used the word adversary is, in the Kremlin. If you don't understand who our adversary is, then you're not suited to be Secretary of State. If you can't say, as I do, that Putin is a war criminal, you don't understand your job and what you're about as Secretary of State, and I have difficulty supporting you to be Secretary of State. He ultimately, under some pressure, voted for him. That was none other than Senator Rubio. Just saying.
Well, you were named by President Biden to the board of the U.S. Institute of Peace.
Oh, yes. Oh.
That has now been dismantled.
We haven't given up. We have sued in the U.S. District Court, myself and most of my fellow board members. We are awaiting a decision by Judge Howell. But you are right. The government, the administration, DOJ came in mid-March and took over USIP, the U.S. Institute of Peace, which for those of you who have been to Washington or been to the Institute, is a beautiful building right across the street from the State Department, created by Congress in the statute that Congress passed in 1984, signed enthusiastically by Ronald Reagan, creating the U.S. Institute of Peace, modest budget, $50 million, $55 million a year. And DOJ took over, and we were authorized by Congress to accept private money to help build this beautiful building dedicated to peace, the U.S. Institute of Peace. DOJ came in and seized the building, transferred it to GSA to be used by the Department of Labor. I'm all for the Department of Labor, but why they're getting this great building to use. Fired all of our employees and canceled all of our programs and contracts. We've sued in district court. We sought a temporary restraining order. The judge denied it, which was a great disappointment. But we're continuing the fight. And the issue really comes down to, and I'm probably not supposed to be talking about this because I'm a plaintiff in I've never been a party to litigation before in my life. So this is a new, I'm a lawyer, I've been an advocate. I've never been the party myself. Did the president have the authority to fire the board? The way they took over the Institute was the president sent all the board members, bipartisan board, 6 Republicans, 6 Democrats. The White House sent us all emails, said we were fired. And then there were 3 ex officio members of the board, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, and the president of the National Defense University, who's always a 3-star flag officer. And those, with the board fired, those 3 board members ex officio then voted to fire our CEO, appoint a 28-year-old, I think he's 28, new acting CEO, who then fired everybody at the Institute and canceled all our contracts and our programs and transferred our building to GSA. And that's how it happened.
Well, unfortunately, we're out of time, but let's kind of take as a theme that we have not given up the fight.
No, certainly not for Ukraine. And the Ukrainians themselves aren't giving up. And you asked a question, that maybe I'll end on this note. I hope it is, I'm trying to make it a more hopeful ending, about the inevitability of a Russian victory. This is a more subtle example of the administration accepting Russian disinformation. A Russian victory is not inevitable, particularly if the West, led by the United States, continues to support Ukraine. Putin would like the world to believe that victory by Russia is inevitable, that he will achieve his war aims, denazify Ukraine, which means removing the government in Kyiv and instituting, in effect, at a minimum, a puppet regime, make Ukraine like Belarus. Belarus is in a so-called union state with Russia, and that's what, at a minimum, Putin wants for Ukraine, a vassal that Moscow controls, and demilitarize Ukraine. So reduce what is, apart from the Russian Federation, the largest and most effective military fighting force in Europe, which is now the armed forces of Ukraine. It's not the Bundeswehr, it's not the French military, the UK military, it's Ukraine. And he wants that more than 1 million person Ukrainian military to be reduced to a constabulary force of under 100,000. And he's going to do everything he can to achieve those ends, but he doesn't have, short of using nuclear weapons, he doesn't have the ability to, if Ukraine gets the support that morally and in some sense, in some ways legally, given the violations of the UN Charter and international law by the Russian Federation, the support that it needs, Ukraine will continue to exist and eventually could prevail in defending, at a minimum, defining prevailing by maintaining its sovereignty and not being subject to control, and worse, by Russia, by Moscow.
Well, please join me in thanking Ambassador John Sullivan. Thank you. We encourage you to pick up a copy of Ambassador Sullivan's book here. Midnight in Moscow is the title. Here, or at the club, or at your local bookstore. And for more information about membership or upcoming in-person and virtual Commonwealth Club programs, please visit commonwealthclub.org. I'm Stephen Saum. Thank you and take care.
Thank you.